So I want you to look at this image and raise your hand when you see the gray circles in between the blacks, or on the white lines. Raise your hand. Why aren't you? You should all be raising your hand. There's gray circles there. See a couple of you questioning yourselves. Yeah. Yeah, they are moving, right? It feels a little bit like your eyes are like doing a thing. So that's an optical illusion. There are absolutely no gray circles, right? That these are just the black boxes with the white lines in between, but that you saw the gray circles because I asked you to see the gray circles too. So almost immediately everyone's hands went up. But I've also tried to look at this without seeing the gray circles, and I still see them, right? Even though I know it's an optical illusion, I still can't help but see them. And so that's the power of our brains, is that we are able to see things that maybe aren't even there, because not only are we being told, so some of you still stood very strong, you didn't raise your hand, I noticed, and you're like, nope, just not gonna see it. But others of you, right, immediately raise your hand, and I saw a couple of you looking around the room being like, okay, well, they're seeing it, so I'm gonna raise my hand. And that's another thing, right, is that conformity also helps us to move through the world and engage with people in a way that makes it easy for us or comfortable for us. And so that's just one example. We're going to do the Stroop test, which some of you already did in the last workshop with Brian Gittins. But for those of you who didn't, the instructions are is that there's going to be colors. I just want you to pay attention to the colors and not the words. And I want you to yell them out as they come up, okay? Just the colors. Just thinking about the colors, all right? Y'all ready? Okay, full participation, your managers, right? Your leaders. All right, here we go. Red.
Yellow, green, blue, green, red, yellow, blue, red, green, yellow, blue, red, green, yellow.
Great, awesome, good job. Y'all did a really good job. You all know your colors. All right, so we're gonna do it one more time. Actually, 2 more times. Second time, all right, again, colors. Do not pay attention to the words, just pay attention to the colors. All right, go.
Red, yellow, green, blue, green, red, yellow, blue, red, green, yellow, blue, red, green, yellow.
Awesome, that was faster. You're getting really good at your colors. That's awesome. If you have children at home, you can go home and be like, I know the color yellow. It's awesome. Okay, so one more time, again, just color, okay? Just the color of the words. Ready, go.
Red, yellow, green, blue, green, red, yellow, red, green, yellow, red.
All right. That was a nice effort. I thought we did enough training, but obviously you're going to have to go back and tell your children that, no, you do not know your colors very well. I told the instructions really clear, right? Only focus on the color. And so this test is showing that we automatically so quickly associate things together. And so when you see the word red, you automatically associate it with the word red. And that's why the second time around, right, when the colors and the words were automatically associated correctly together, you zoom through that. Sort of all experts, right, in color coordination, I'm sure. But in this one, you like stopped. You stuttered a little bit. You slowed down. And it was sort of like, there's this TED Talk that we use sometimes in our trainings too, that his name's Jerry King, and he talks about how it's like you're moving through molasses almost. It's like, oh my gosh, I feel like I know, but I'm trying to get there and I can't. So it's the same idea, is that our brains so automatically categorize and associate that it's so hard for us to even pull it apart, even though you knew the directions were telling you to focus on the color, not on the word. And so that's just another example of how quickly our minds use implicit bias as the default, and that we move through the world. And sometimes I'm sure you've done this before, where you read words and the words are spelled incorrectly, but you've read it correctly and you didn't even notice the misspelling, right? That's why it's always good to get somebody to proofread your work, because you're missing it, because that's what you're seeing, right? And so that's another example of how quickly we associate in our minds what we're doing with the sort of the words or the letters in front of us, that we sometimes miss simple spelling errors. So this is because we react even before we realize it, right? You all were slowing down, and some of you just kind of gave up at the end. You're just like, I don't know what color that is, so I'm just gonna stop. Because the minute your brain is like thrashing like that, it's working really, really hard. So we react before we realize it because we are processing 11 million bits a second. Don't ask me what a bit is, but it's a lot. right? 11 million, that's a lot, because in actuality, our prefrontal cortex, the part of our brain that is the thinking part of our brain, is only processing 40 bits of information out of that 11 million. So the 11 other million is like you're sorting that stuff, you're putting that somewhere else. So that means, like, as I'm looking around this room, I'm sorting you into categories, I'm sure of it, even though I'm not even acutely aware of that myself. So you sort into categories that you know about. I don't know if anybody's seen The Office. Anybody seen The Office? Mm-hmm. Where Michael, like, does that, like, association with, like, what people look like in this office setting, and it's, like, really, really problematic. But he's, like, starting to sort people based on what they look like, right? That's, like, that's like explicit bias. He's like explicitly telling you how he sorts you, but that we actually do this without thinking about it. If you haven't seen that episode, it's quite funny. We create associations. So again, we associate those words so tightly bound together that when they're not the same, we have difficulty pulling them apart. We fill in gaps. So when we receive partial information, we just fill it in based on previous experiences, priming, situations that we've already been through. And then we also create schemas based on partial information. So, are all schemas bad? That's a really good question. In terms of schemas, not all of them are actually bad because they help us to move through the world because of all those bits of information. So, a schema could be either a preference. And so a preference is if I decided that I preferred a certain food over another. So, you know, if I had a barbecue and I invited all of you to the barbecue, and I had a hamburger, a brat, because we're in Wisconsin, and a veggie burger, what would you choose? Who would choose the hamburger? Raise your hand. All right, not that many hamburgers, but okay, I won't get that many for my barbecue. What about a brat? Raise your hand. All right, a couple more, and then veggie burger. Wow, that's a pretty even mix there. All right, so you just exerted a preference, right? It's different if I was actually visiting somebody in Spain last summer, and he was telling me, he's like, how dare those vegetarians make their own restaurants? Because when I go as a meat eater, there's nothing that I can eat there. And I was like, or just go next door to any other restaurant, right? And so he was exerting a prejudice. Right? So he was having a prejudice, a negative connotation, a negative feeling towards people that are vegetarians because he's a meat eater and thinks it's ridiculous, right? He also said some stuff about like Hillary Clinton and smoking on airplanes that didn't make a lot of sense. But so this is when schemas become problematic, is that when we fill in gaps of information, when we don't have that information, and then we have a prejudice, sort of a negative connotation towards something, that can be a problem. And so that's when we want to be really aware of these prejudices, because those are things that when we are unaware of what we're holding that might not be based on real information, that's when bias can play out. So I think about my father, who says a lot of the times, he says, never assume anything. And as a teenager, they used to frustrate me. So like he'd be late to pick me up from like soccer practice, and he'd be like, never assume that I'm going to be on time. Just like I don't understand that one, but you know, he was just like, you know, I have lots of things to do too. Never assume that I'm always going to be on time. Always assume that I'm going to be late. So you know that one, but he has some reality behind what he was saying, right? Is that don't assume things about things that we actually don't know about or we can't judge because people are different than us. And so when we assume, especially in the workplace, we assume somebody's going to do something and then they don't, that assumption can get us into trouble unless we've communicated that really, really clearly and transparently. And then that's when we can have a conversation about it. And so sometimes we are in our own heads, and sometimes we think that we're saying a thing and telling somebody to do something, and in actuality we're not. And then that's when bias can play out, when prejudice can come in, when we're not sort of in control of those assumptions and filling in those gaps. So this is an example, which some of you might have heard too, because it happened pretty recently. But one of my colleagues, he's a black man, and he works at the YWCA. He's a manager like y'all, so he sort of supervises a couple of people in our employment and training department. And Famous Dave's is located like a couple blocks down the street from one of our locations, which is on Park Street, on sort of the south end of Park Street, kind of towards the Beltline. And so for 40th birthday, his colleague was going to take him out to lunch, another black man. And this other black man works in our restorative justice programs in schools, working towards sort of interrupting the school to prison pipeline for kids of color. And so they said, we're going to go out to lunch together and I'm going to treat you. Choose where you want to go. And so it was during the workday. It was like a Wednesday afternoon, so they went to Famous Dave's. I've never actually been to Famous Dave's because I actually am a vegetarian. So, I don't, other than what I saw on the website, which I did pull this off the website, I don't know much else about it. So they were there on Park Street sitting at Famous Dave's, and there weren't that many people there. It was, Wednesday at noon, so maybe one other person or a group of people in the whole restaurant. And they were just chatting. Both of them have children, are raising children in Madison. All of them are black children. So just kind of talking about some of the struggles. Tori, he's the one that told me the story. He has a son that's in high school and sort of preparing to enter adulthood, and so feeling a little bit stressed about that. And then my other colleague, Bill, has some sort of elementary and sort of middle teen children, so he was kind of listening to him. And they're both like quiet people. They're not people that make a ruckus about anything. Sometimes they walk past my office and like very politely check in. We did a mindfulness workshop the other day, and we had these like dots that we had to use. And the mindfulness dots were supposed to be for you to pause and look at it and pause when you see those dots during the day. And so I lost mine, and I had told Bill that. And the next day he brought me some dots he had found in his car. They were shaped like hearts. From his daughter, but still did the job. So they were sitting at Famous Dave's having this really nice lunch, and then a woman came over who had not been their initial server, and she said, I'm going to be taking your check because the other woman who was serving you earlier is afraid of you. And so, the two of them were sitting there like, wait, what? Wait, she's afraid of us? And Tori said he was so in disbelief because they had just come from a place that they were leaders. Right? They're leaders in our organization, and they came just a couple blocks down the road, and then all of a sudden somebody's afraid of them. And this is absolutely based in this other woman's bias, right? Her bias against black men and assuming fear immediately after seeing them. And so whether or not that's based in a reality, it still was not based in reality based on these two men, right? And so she was lumping them into a category that wasn't accurate, was very racist, and how it impacted them was that they were hurt by that, right? And so, right away they were like, okay. Tori was like, okay, we'll give you our check. And the woman said, you should hurry up. It's time to go, basically. And Bill said, I'm not okay with this. I'd really like to give her my check. And there's woman, the initial server, is sitting. She's a very young white woman. She was standing by the counter or bar and was like watching them kind of out of the corner of her eye, right? Very cowered over, very fearful looking. And Bill, because of the person that he is, he's the one that brought me extra pause dots because he wants me to pause throughout my day. He is absolutely living mindfulness, I would say. He went over to her and he said, I'm really sorry that you felt scared. I'm not sure why, but here's our check. And I really hope that next time we come in that you're not going to feel this way. And so he left, right? And so whether or not he planted a seed, it was based, unfortunately, in a situation where they had to deal with the racism of another person who was not checking her bias. And so that's how it can happen too, is that when you have unchecked bias, and then, of course, her defense was getting somebody else to do the job, rather than sitting with that and being like, what is going on for me? These men have done nothing to me. Why am I feeling this way, right? And that's what you can start to do, is really processing through that. Just like Jesse Jackson had done in that moment, is thinking about, how am I reacting to this? What could I do differently next time? I need to be more aware that this is my tendency. So what is this thing? I keep talking about this. I gave you a couple exercises to hear about it or experience it a little bit. Well, implicit bias can be contrary to our stated beliefs and attitudes. So we can say that we believe in health equity, we believe in equity for everybody, we believe in healthcare as a human right, but then behave in ways that are really biased. So that's the struggle with bias. Implicit bias is one of those things that is counter to oftentimes our deep-seated beliefs and values. Implicit bias is also created, transmitted, and reinforced through priming, so those previous experiences we talked about. So if you had a previous experience with so there was a story about a little girl, and she had a little black and white cat, and she loved her cat. They cuddled every day, and she's 2 years old, and she goes outside, and she sees her cat in the yard. She runs over to the cat. It's not a cat. Guess what it is? Yeah, so her priming told her that that was her cat, right? Because that was the only experience she had ever had. now she learned, right, that experience was not valid. That schema she had to change. It's a preference for or against, right, a person or a group of people. It's subconscious, so we are not aware we have them oftentimes unless we create that awareness. And it's triggered automatically through rapid associations and stereotypes. So those stereotypes in the media that we're being fed as well, so we are seeing images of people that are different from us, sort of depicted in certain ways, and we are taking that in, and that's feeding bias. So we'll talk about some strategies to sort of interrupt those images, because unfortunately the media is not a place to interrupt your implicit biases, because in a way the media is also biased based on whoever is putting out the stories, right? Whoever's writing the stories, how they're writing and depicting people in the stories. And a more simple version of what bias is biases are what we make out about people before we know who they are. So I might have come into this room, you might have made up a story about who I am, where I'm at in my life, what I do, previous experiences that I've had, and so that's also another piece, is that we often, when people come in, new members come in, new employees come in, we make up stories about who they are. That's just a part of human nature, right? Is like putting people into categories, sorting to make use of those 11 million bits that we have going through our mind. And so just being aware of it is the first start. Also, really important too, because this is sort of the frame that the YWCA comes from in doing this work, and of course we're partnering with GHC, we're in our second year of partnership, is that when you have prejudice, unchecked prejudice, so again, this is based on, this is the difference where negative connotations, right, negative preferences for or against people, prejudice is the negative one. When you have unchecked prejudice and power, and you all have power, not only based on skin color, gender, right, but also based on role within an organization, that can lead to racism and race-based privilege, right? And then you're perpetuating things without even knowing that, because of that dynamic with prejudice and power. So if we're not aware of our prejudices and we have power, the impact can be really detrimental. And I know a bunch of the people that you serve, the members that come into your organization, I don't know how many was it again that you say you have now? Forget the number.
It's about 75,000.
75,000. I was like, is anybody listening? 75,000, right? That's a lot of people. I'm guessing that's a pretty diverse group. That is diverse based on sexual orientation, gender identity, race and ethnicity, right? Language ability, age, income, right? All of these things that feed into who people are, and that if we are not aware of what we're doing to perpetuate sort of our prejudices, and we have power over them, then we will be perpetuating racism and race-based privileges. There are so many out there, it's actually pretty scary to look these things up. And I know that many of you are very much aware that healthcare and implicit bias is a really real thing. There was a woman that we worked with at the YWCA who passed away last year from cancer. She was a black woman living in this community. She'd worked at the YWCA for, 30 years or so. Her children still work at the YWCA. She still has small children going to school in the Madison community. And she was on hospice for probably close to a year towards the end of her life. And she died maybe in her mid-40s. She was quite young. And one of the struggles she had was healthcare, was getting access to drugs that can relieve her pain. And I know we have an opioid epidemic and all this kind of sort of feelings around prescription drugs, and particularly around opioids and benzos. But this woman she basically had to go to 3 different doctors before, and she had an advocate with her. She had an advocate coming to the appointments with her, also a black woman, her friend, but also an advocate. And she said, I'm dying, I'm in so much pain. She had a blood cancer, and it was really, really painful. And she said, I just need some narcotics to help me sleep so I can still be with my 11-year-old, before I die. And the doctor said, no, you're gonna sell these. I can't prescribe these to you. And that was based on 0 priming of her. She had never been charged with any kind of distributing of drugs, but that was based on the bias of the doctor, and that impact lasts and is perpetuated through her children, right? Is this fear of the healthcare system, but also the sadness about what their mother had to go through before her death. So I share that with you because I could give you examples of this happening with some of our residents every single week within healthcare systems. I'm not saying that it's happening just at GHC, but definitely this is a real thing that's happening in our community, and we need to be aware of it so that we can start to interrupt it. So this journal article came out of the American Journal of Public Health in December of 2015, basically saying that implicit and racial ethnic bias among healthcare professionals can influence healthcare outcomes. Obviously we know that, but also this is sort of a systematic review of a bunch of different articles. And the conclusion, because it was a really long review, was that most health providers appear to have implicit bias in terms of positive attitudes towards whites and negative attitudes towards people of color. Interventions targeting implicit attitudes are needed because implicit bias will contribute to health disparities, right? So we know this. We just need to be acutely aware of how our biases are also impacting our members. This is another one, and I can't stop sharing this one. This one some of you have already seen in the microaggressions workshop that I did last year before that, a while ago. But this came out of the Washington Post, and it was an article about I think it was 2016, about sort of the disturbing reasons as to why African American patients may be undertreated for pain. There's a list, I hope you can see it, there's a list of fantastical differences between whites and blacks that are listed up on the screen. And the article talked about how they surveyed I think it was over like a couple thousand medical students and residents on these fantastical differences, and over 50% of them believed them to be true. So one of which is black skin is thicker than whites. Black's blood coagulates more quickly. Whites have larger brains. Black's nerve endings are less sensitive. If you can think about how this might impact their care, if this is the belief of people being trained in the medical field right now, that could be horrific. Horrific consequences could come out of that. And so I think about how important it is that y'all are here today as GHC to think about interrupting these things. The scary thing was that many of them, 25% of them, didn't actually believe that sickle cell anemia was more prevalent in African Americans. And they actually got taught that information. So that's the power of implicit bias, is that they stored that somewhere in the back of their brains, and the 40 bits that they took in was based on all of these other messages that they were primed with, right? That were inaccurate, based on prejudice, and that instead they were reacting to those on this exam that they took.